So hello and welcome everyone to this tutorial session. In this video, we will understand what are functions and why do we use them in Python. So we start off this video by understanding what are functions. Then we will discuss different types of functions that we can generally use in our Python program. So there are basically two categories. First is the built-in functions and second is the user-defined functions. So after discussing the types, we will practically implement some examples related to user-defined function. And in the last, we will understand what is a lambda function, which is also known as a anonymous function in Python. So without any further delay, let's jump on to our first topic and understand what are functions. So if you have seen our previous tutorial sessions, we have talked about these two programming methods. First is this dry approach and second is this modular programming. So according to dry approach, we should never repeat our code. We should write our Python program in such a way that we should never repeat any code in our program. And according to modular programming, we should break our large Python program into small chunks. Now to implement these two programming approaches, we generally utilize functions, classes and class methods in Python. Now out of these three, let's first understand functions. Now functions plays very important part in implementing these two approaches. So if there is some task in our Python program that needs to be repeat frequently, then in such cases we can group that set of statements into a function and reuse it. So function in Python is simply a reusable block of code. Now within this block of code, we can define some set of Python statements and then we can use this block wherever required in our Python program. Now this effectively arranges the code and prevents from being repeated. Moreover, a function helps the software becoming more ordered as it grows. Now if we move little further, so in Python there are basically two main categories of function. First is this built-in function and second is a user-defined function. So let's discuss these two types in more detail. So a built-in function in Python is just like pre-installed application that comes in our computer or mobile. So the pre-installed applications are the applications which are already installed on our system. In the same manner, built-in functions are functions in Python which are already defined, whose definition is already defined in Python. Now we as a user can use those built-in functions anytime when we want in our program. Now Python consists more than 72 built-in functions and we can use this function directly in our program. Now let's practically understand how we can use these built-in functions in Python. So here we will discuss about two most popular built-in functions that we use quite frequently throughout our program. So first is this print function. Now the role of this print function is to print a results on our console, and after the print function there is an input function. The role of this input function is to take input from the end user. So what we are doing in this block of code, first we have used this print function. So we are printing this string on our console, enter your name. After this, we are taking input using the input function and we are storing it in the name variable. And in the last, we are printing out a result stating hello and then followed by the name variable. So if I execute this cell, you can see it is asking me for my name. So if I write Adam and hit enter, you can see I got this result, hello Adam. So as I told you, there are many built-in functions in Python. So we will discuss many more throughout this tutorial. But these were the two most popular built-in functions. So after built-in functions, the second category related to function is the user-defined function. So as the name defines, these functions are the functions which are defined by the user. So we generally create a user-defined function. So when a user simply define a function in his program, that is referred as a user defined function. Now we generally create functions to execute some specific tasks in our program, and to execute these functions we need to call them. So let's first understand how we can define a user defined function in Python. To define a user defined function, we use the def keyword. So this is the complete syntax that we generally use. So to define a function in our Python program, first we have to use this def keyword. Now after the def keyword, we can define our function name. Now after the function name, we have to use parenthesis, and within the parenthesis we can define parameters for our function. These parameters are simply some values that we want to use within our function. So after defining the parameters and closing the parenthesis, we have to use this colon. After the colon, we have to define the function body. Here you can see easily the function body is having some indentation so that the Python interpreter can understand this function body comes under this function. And in the last, we can use a return statement in our function to return certain value. Now defining parameters and defining a return statement both are optional in a user defined function. So we can create a function without defining any parameter or without using the return statement. So let's first understand a simple example related to user defined function. So here you can see an example. So what we are doing first, we are using the def keyword, and then we have defined this greet. So greet is the name of the function, and then we have used this parenthesis. Now here we are not using any parameter values. After this, under the indentation, we have defined this print statement, hello from Python guides. And to end the function body, we will simply come out of this indentation, and whenever we come out of this indentation, our function will be ended. So after defining this function, what we are doing, we are calling it. So basically, to use any function in Python, we need to call it, and to call a function, we simply need to define its name followed by its parenthesis, and if it takes any parameters, then we need to define that parameter values. So here in this case, it does not take any parameter values, so we haven't defined any. So if I execute this cell, you can see we got our result, hello from Python guides. Now let's move to our next topic and understand how we can use arguments in our function. Now arguments in a function are utilized to pass certain values inside the function, and we can specify arguments just after the function name within the function parenthesis. So if we look back at the syntax of defining a function, we told you that we can pass certain parameters to our function within the parenthesis. So arguments are simply values to this parameter. Now we can define multiple parameters or arguments in our function by just separating them by using a comma. So let us understand how we can use arguments within our function with an example. So here you can see an example. So here what we are doing first, we have defined function sqrt. So this is a short form for square root. Now within the parenthesis, we have defined a parameter which is num. Now within the function body, we have taken a result variable and we are calculating the square root, and we are using this num parameter to calculate the square root, and in the end we are using the print function to print the square root. Now once we define our square root function, we are calling it and we are passing 144 as an argument. So 144 is an integer value and we are passing it as an argument. Now this 144 is the value of the num parameter. So when we execute this cell, it will pass 144 in place of num. So result will be num to the power 0.5, and it will calculate its square root and it will return this statement, the square root of 144 is 12. Now this is a basic example related to an argument. Now there are different types of arguments that we can use in our Python function. So first is the default argument, second is the keyword argument, and third is the variable length argument. So we will discuss all these three arguments in detail. So let's move to the first one, default argument. So if we look back to our previous example, so here in this example, you have seen I have passed 144. Now what will happen if I don't specify any value while calling this function? So if I execute this, you can see here I got an error where Python interpreter is stating that required value is missing. So in such cases, we generally use default arguments. So default arguments are nothing but the parameter with some default value, and that value will be utilized when we don't pass any argument while calling the function. So let us look at the example related to default argument first. So here we have defined this function info. Now after this, we have defined a parameter name, and we are using equal to sign to assign certain value to it. So I have assigned Adam string value to it. Now within this function, we are simply creating a string. Hi, my name is, and then in the last, the name will come. So this name can be any string, and we are using this print function to print the string result. Now while calling this function, if I don't specify any value, then what will happen? It will automatically take this default value Adam and return the result based upon that. And if I specify any other value, for example, I specify John, then it will take John and return the result according to that. Now, after the default argument, we can also use keyword arguments in Python. So for keyword arguments in a function, we can specify the argument name along with the values, simply eliminating the need for remembering the parameter order. Now let's understand this thing also with the help of an example. So here I have defined another example, get name, which takes two parameters, and we have defined two parameters within it. First is this first underscore name and second is this second underscore name. And within the function, what we are doing, we are concatenating these two values and we will return full name as a result. Now, while calling this function and passing the arguments, we have to pass the arguments in the same order in which we have defined it. So first I have to define the first name and then I have to define the last name. If I say Chris is my first name and Hemsworth is the last name, and if I execute this cell, let me comment out this last statement first. So if I execute this cell, you can see we got our result, Chris Hemsworth as a full name. But if I am having multiple parameters, then remembering the order of all the arguments will be very difficult. So in such cases, what we can do, we can use keyword argument. So in the keyword argument, what we simply do, so we define our argument with the parameter name. So here you can see an example. So here first I have defined last name equal to Hemsworth, and then I have defined first name, which is Chris. So now if I execute this cell, it will automatically assign Chris to this first name parameter and Hemsworth argument to this last name parameter and return the result. Now let's move to our next type and discuss about variable length argument. So till now we already knew how many number of parameters we need in the function, but there will be many instances where we do not know the exact number of required argument. So in such cases, Python facilitates us with the variable length argument where we can pass any number of arguments. Moreover, Python will treat this variable length argument as a tuple. So let's understand this thing also with the help of an example. So here you can see an example. What I am doing, I am declaring a function square, then I am defining a variable length argument. Now to define a variable length argument, we simply need to put this asterisk, or we can say simply star, in front of the parameter name. So I want to define this nums parameter as a variable length argument, and then within the function we are using the for loop. Now as I told you, whenever we will take variable length argument, Python will treat it as a tuple. So we are using for loop to iterate through each item in the tuple, and then we are separating its square. So this function will simply return the square of an integer value. After defining this function definition, what we are doing, we are calling the function. For this we have defined the name, and this time we have passed four different integer values to this function, 3, 7, 5, 9. Now if I execute this cell, what will happen? 3, 7, 5, 9, these four values will be passed as a variable length argument. We can even pass more arguments based on our requirement, and then within the function these four values are passed as a tuple, and we are using for loop to iterate through each item and calculate its square. So square of 3 will be 9, 7 will be 49, and square of 5 will be 25, and in the last we got our result square of 9 as 81. So with this, I hope all the different type of arguments are clear to you. And let's move to our next topic and understand about another example. So in the syntax, we have discussed that we can use a return statement in our function, but till now we haven't used it. So here we will discuss how we can use it. The role of a return statement is very simple. It is used to return certain value as a result of the function. Now whenever we use a return statement in our function, it will simply end the function execution after the return statement and returns the result to the place where function was called. So in a function we can only use a return statement once, because when we use it, it will end the function execution once it reaches the return statement, and it will return that result back to the place where it has been originally called. So let's understand this thing also with the help of an example. So here you can see an example. Again, we are repeating our square root function. We have passed num parameter to it, and we are calculating the square root in the result variable. And this time, after calculating the square root, we are using the return statement and we are returning the result. Now after the return statement, the function will be automatically ended. So even if we try to define anything after the return statement, for example, I want to put a print statement here and say hello. Now if I call the function, now I'm calling this function within the print function, and then I'm calling this function here and pass 169 as my value. Now if I execute this function, you can see we got our result. The square root of 169 is 13, but this hello statement is not printed. This is because after every return statement, the execution gets automatically ended. Plus, even if we try to put multiple return statements in our program, it will also not work, because once the return statement is been called, the function will be automatically ended. Now let's move to our last topic and discuss about anonymous functions. So till now we are declaring and calling function in our Python program with a name, but Python also facilitates us to declare a function without any name. So these functions are commonly known as anonymous function in Python. So generally when we define a function, we use this def keyword, but to define an anonymous function, we use lambda keyword. Due to this, anonymous functions are also referred as lambda functions. To define a lambda function in Python, we simply use this syntax. So first is this lambda keyword, then we can define our arguments. After putting a colon, we can define the expression that we want to execute. So now let's execute an example related to lambda function as well. So here you can see I'm defining a lambda function. So first I have used this lambda keyword. Then after the lambda keyword, I have specified two arguments, num underscore 1 and num underscore 2. And after that, I have put colon. After the colon, we have to define the expression. So my expression is this num1 multiply by num2. So it will simply return product of two numbers, and I have assigned this whole thing to multiply variable. Now after this, I am using a print function. Within the print function, I have put a string. So the product of 13 and 21 is, after this here I am calling my lambda function multiply, and I have passed two values 13 and 21. So what it will do, it will calculate the product of these two numbers and return the result. So whenever I execute this cell, you can see we got our result. Product of 13 and 21 is 273. Now always remember one thing, that in a lambda function we can define multiple arguments, but we can only define one expression. So with this we have come to the end of this tutorial session. Thank you so much for watching. We will see you in the next one.